Once the bag rotation master controller and the root were done, I've locked their transform channel so that I was sure I would not edit them by mistake. From there I will select all the other controller and get rid of all the keys but the very first one. Since the bag deformations are very fast, it's easier for me to rework them from scratch than trying to work from what we have blocked before. Whenever I want to create a pose, I will make sure that the previous keyframe is currently keyed. This way I'm sure to avoid any undesired interpolations. On frame 12, I will kind of sculpt the bag as it received the first jab by pushing the tweaker controller, and then a couple of frames later I will just cancel all the transforms so that the bag recovers its shape. Then a frame later I will pull a bit the controller that was hit by the punch so that we get a very subtle shake feeling. Then I will repeat the process for the next punch. I will key all the controller on frame 16, the frame prior to the hit or impact. Then on frame 17 I will sculpt the bag by pushing the tweaker bone but also scaling them on one axis and then scaling them down on the opposite axis. I'm trying to preserve the volume of the bag. From there, 4 frames later, I will cancel all the transform. And then I will refine the shape of the bag frame by frame. Since the hitting frames are pretty short, it's a very fast process. Rebuilding the whole animation for the whole bag took me about half an hour. And then I started over again with the hook, sculpting the pose from scratch using the tweaker bones. And as soon as I was done with the hook, guess what? I did exactly the same thing with the kick. I've exclusively started working on those deformation frames using the tweaker bones. And that's pretty important because they are very easy to use and to sculpt those specific impacts. Then I start working using the blue controllers. Those are the forward kinematic controllers that will allow us to slightly bend the bag. We could spend hours in the graph editor polishing those controllers, but instead I've kept the process as simple as possible, keying as less frame as possible and letting Blender interpolate between those frames. So I'm selecting all the controllers from the one just upon the impact frame toward the tip of the bag. Then make sure that you are using individual origin so that we will be able to bend all the controller at once. And just bend the bag toward its previous position as if it was dragging as less as possible. If you bend it too much, it won't look realistic because it will look too smooth. And from there, if you don't jump into the graph editor, that's gonna be hard to make it look good. And as soon as I reach the next impact frame, I'm keying the frame before the impact, and then I'm slightly increasing the curvature of the bag on the impact. Then when the hook is about to happen, this is the time where the bag is traveling the fastest, so I will slightly bend it toward, again, its previous position. And this is how you create this subtle dragging almost for free. The trick is to make sure that you manipulate all the bone in the chain at the same time. Since they have a parent and child relationship, you rotate the parent, that makes the child rotating too, and then you apply on top of this a bit of rotation on the child, etc, etc. And it generates a slight bend in the bag that looks very natural. The only moment where I had to be a little more creative was on the kick, where I've posed the bones frame by frame. On the frame prior to the kick, I've just made the whole bag dragging, and then on the impact, I first made the top part of the bag to rotate to the right behind the leg of the character, while the lower part of the bag will be dragging, so I will invert its rotation and rotate it a bit backward. Since the bag is arriving very fast and we're kicking it the opposite direction, there is a lot of deformation in the bag. Then, as it is projected by the kick, I will slightly bend it backward toward its previous position to make it drag a bit. And finally, as it hits the ground, I bend it toward its previous direction so that it is dragging again. And then I will cancel the rotation a couple of frames after and convert all the landing keys and the keys after to vectors so that I have a hard slap on the ground. One final touch I've added is that I've used the tweaker controller to squash the bag on the ground. In the end, it's barely noticeable because I've kept it very subtle. I've selected all the tweaker bone, inserted a keyframe on the key prior to squash the bag so that I don't get any weird interpolation. Then I've scaled them up a bit on the X and Y axis and flattened it, scaling it down on the Z axis. And then 2 or 3 frames later, I've cancelled any scale by pressing Alt-S. One final detail I have revised, but I'm not sure I've captured it, is the rotation of the bag just after the right cross. I've slightly lowered the level of rotation of the bag so that it stays on screen while we are rotating around the character. This is typically the kind of detail I wouldn't have taken care of a year ago, for example. But it's very important because it does improve the readability of your animation. But this is typically the kind of detail that will bring you to a professional level of animation, because it shows that you care for your audience and make sure that they will get everything about your animation.